bibliography of his work. It included a history and a novel, and although I suspect those probably weren't ready for the publisher's house at that point, isn't it remarkable that a 10-year-old would think to sit down and write a bibliography about the fruits of their intellectual labors? Jack C. Lewis absolutely loved his mother, and it's difficult to fathom the depths of pain that he must have endured when she died suddenly when he was only 10 years old. Her passing marked the beginning of the most difficult period of Lewis's life. His father, uncertain how to raise two young boys and determined that his sons would have an opportunity to pursue respectable careers, decided to send them to a boarding school in England rather than in Ireland. Unfortunately, he chose the worst, absolutely the worst English boarding school then in operation. The buildings at Wynyard were dilapidated and dreary. The headmaster was absolutely brutal and regularly beat pupils who could not remember their recitations. Years later, Warren Lewis wrote that the stench of the outdoor shed where the boys kept their lunches and used the lavatory was one of the most abiding memories of his life. He also recalled that the headmaster's idea of a math curriculum was to have the students work sums over and over again on their slates with no oversight. Warren stated that he spent most of one school year doing the same 4 sums over and over and over again. Some of C.S. Lewis's biographers have attributed his problems with math, even basic math, to the trauma that he experienced during his 2 years at Wynyard. Lewis himself confided to a friend years later that he had struggled to overcome the hatred and resentment that he felt toward the Reverend Robert Capron, who ran Wynyard School. It took him 50 years and his own impending death to finally be able to release the hatred and forgive Capron for his cruelty. Free from Wynyard in 1910, Lewis then bounced from school to school for the next few years, often following in Warren's footsteps. Now, Warren was quite the rebel, and he introduced his younger brother to the pleasures of smoking and drinking at a very young age. In fact, Lewis was 12 years old when he developed his lifelong smoking habit. Fortunately, he never fell into the life of alcoholism that plagued his elder brother, but he did drink alcohol regularly for the rest of his life. And the teenage Lewis was definitely not the slightly plump, friendly-looking figure we see staring out at us from later photographs. He was quite thin and admittedly obnoxious. He later commented that as a teenager, I began to labor very hard to make myself into a fop, a cad, and a snob. A self-admitted prig by the age of 14, Lewis was also something of a misfit at the elite schools he attended. He was an unathletic, bookish intellectual who loved music and literature in an era when athletes were heroes and sports and girls consumed the free time of most English schoolboys. Even more shocking from our perspective, one of Lewis's classmates recalled that Lewis was, quote, a riotously amusing atheist. He really was pretty foul-mouthed about it, end quote. At one point, Lewis wrote to a friend that the Christian God is a spirit more cruel and barbarous than any man. Are you beginning to see my point about the differences between historical myth and reality? How many of you ever imagined that the great C.S. Lewis was a stuck-up, marginal student who smoked like a chimney, drank like a fish, and cursed like a sailor? I know I didn't, but that is the truth of it. Lewis was an ordinary boy whom God used to do extraordinary things. In 1916, at the age of 18, Lewis went to Oxford to take the entrance exam. This was a life-changing decision. World War I had been raging for over 2 years by this point, and Warren Lewis was already serving in the British Army. C.S. had the opportunity to avoid conscription by attending a university in Ireland, because Ireland did not have conscription during World War I. But Lewis was determined to make it into Oxford and to join the officer training corps there. He succeeded on both counts. but he barely passed the entrance exam for Oxford. In fact, he never passed the math portion of the Oxford entrance exam, even though he took the test twice. But because of his military service, when he came back from the war, Oxford gave him a waiver for that portion of his exam. When Lewis arrived at University College in Oxford in April of 1917, most of the school was being used as an infirmary for wounded soldiers. He was one of only 12 undergraduates at the college, and there were only 3 freshmen in his class. Though he absolutely loved his time at Oxford, it was very brief. 8 weeks after his arrival, he was moved to Keble College, Oxford, to join the cadet battalion and receive his commission as a lieutenant in the 3rd Battalion of the Somerset Light Infantry. 4 weeks later, after pitifully little military training, he was shipped off to France. And 12 days after that, he was in the frontline trenches, where almost 1 million of his fellow countrymen lost their lives and where millions more were wounded. It is hard to imagine the bookish Lewis living in the mud and filth and horror of the World War I trenches. His initial letters home indicated he was not particularly upset about his situation. But within a month, he was already in the hospital recovering from trench fever, a condition caused by lice. He had 27 days of convalescence and was sent back to the front lines. Just 2 weeks later, he was wounded by an exploding shell that killed a sergeant that was standing nearby. He ended up with 3 pieces of shrapnel in his body, one of which lodged so close to his heart the doctors were never able to remove it. Interestingly, that wound didn't bother him near as much as the wound that he took to his wrist. It bothered him the rest of his life. The war had a lasting impact on Lewis. He was the only survivor of the group of 6 young men, part of his cadet corps at Keble College, and he endured terrifying nightmares for years afterwards. But fortunately for Lewis, the war ended just a year after his military service began, and he was able to return to the life of the academy. He published his first book, Spirits in Bondage, in March 1919 when he was just 20 years old. Sales weren't that great, but Lewis pressed on. He worked hard in graduate school and finally earned a teaching position at Magdalen College at Oxford in 1925. He spent most of the next 3 decades there, but finished his teaching career at Magdalen College in Cambridge. Time doesn't permit me to go into many more details about Lewis's life, but I do want to mention one more surprising twist. In 1956, at the age of 58, Lewis married an American divorcee named Joy Davidman in a civil ceremony. Davidman's 2 sons, David and Douglas, accompanied her to England when she wed. Lewis's Christian friends were absolutely appalled by what he had done, and many shunned him for the rest of his life. Not only was Lewis's wife Jewish, but she was a former registered communist. And this was 1956, when communism seemed to be sweeping over the globe like an iron curtain, and democratic governments were looking for fifth-column communist infiltrators behind every door. Though many questioned Lewis's motives and sanity when he married his longtime pen pal so late in life, there is no doubt that Lewis and Davidman were deeply in love. Her death from bone cancer just 3 years later sent Lewis into a deep depression and a spiritual battle that almost undid him. It took him a year to finally reconcile her death with his faith. By then, Lewis was only 18 months away from his own homegoing. He suffered greatly in the final 2 years of his life. In the summer of 1961, he was diagnosed with prostate cancer, but his kidneys and heart were so bad by that point that doctors could not operate on the cancer. He had a catheter for the rest of his life and was in so much pain that he slept in a chair. After almost dying in 1962 and being revived, he commented, "Poor Lazarus, but God knows best." Lewis was ready to go home. The brief reprieve was a burden he did not wish to bear. On November 22nd, 1963, the same day on which Aldous Huxley and John F. Kennedy died, Clive Staples Lewis went home to be with his Lord and Savior. I cannot help but think that he must have been greeted with those words that we all long to hear. Well done, thou good and faithful servant.
You heard Deb say at the end of her presentation something very significant about Lewis, one of those interesting little twists about his life that in a way explains this conference. He did in fact die on the same day as John F. Kennedy and Aldous Huxley. And some of you may be aware, but if you're not, I'll let you know about a book written kind of on that theme of their death by a Christian philosopher named Peter Kraft. The title of the book is Between Heaven and Hell. It's an imaginary dialogue between Aldous Huxley, the pantheist, John F. Kennedy, the nominal Christian humanist, and C.S. Lewis, the evangelical Christian, somewhere between heaven and hell. It is a fascinating little trialogue, and I commend it to you for your not only entertainment but instruction. Peter Kraft, K-R-E-E-F-T, Between Heaven and Hell. And as you might guess, because the whole world was riveted by the news of the assassination of President Kennedy in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, the passing of C.S. Lewis, as popular and as well known as he was almost completely lost, which is certainly understandable in light of that present moment. But it's an interesting thing, and I mean this in no political way and in no disparaging way. It is an interesting thing that here we are 50 years later, and this is the 50th anniversary next month, the 50th anniversary of the passing of C.S. Lewis. And I'm sure that ours is not the only C.S. Lewis conference being held in this round world. I'm sure there are many, many others because of the tremendous influence that C.S. Lewis has had. I'm not sure how many John F. Kennedy conferences there will be. I'm sure there'll be documentaries and reminiscences and the like. But the impact of C.S. Lewis has been so great for so long, and he being dead yet speaks. And that is what explains this conference. And once again, I just want to welcome you. We're so glad that you are here. I did forget to mention one very important detail a moment ago, and I need to do that, and that is the restroom facilities. In our church, we have facilities just outside the doorway there in the foyer area, and then also downstairs in the fellowship hall where the banquet will be later on. There's some other details about our schedule for the weekend, but Professor Huebner will bring you up to date on and speed on all of those after Dr. Fant delivers our first plenary address. And I want to take this moment now to introduce him to you. I know that you have a bio here in your program. It has been my privilege to get to know Dr. Fant. I've spent 4 wonderful years at Union University, which is, well, I don't say this lightly, I truly don't. I think it is the finest Christian university in America. And the president there, who has announced his transition to the role of chancellor, they're in a presidential search even as we speak, has done an amazing job by God's grace. He's an amazing man. Dr. David Dockery has been president there 18 years. And anybody who knows anything about higher education knows that what God has used him to accomplish there is almost beyond astonishing. And all done for the glory of God, and all done with excellence and in a way that honors and glorifies Christ Jesus. And a very important part of the development of this world-class, Christ-centered institution is Dr. Gene Fant. And I don't say that lightly. Dr. Fant has an amazing record of scholarship and teaching himself. What we've included here is what we could squeeze in with the limited amount of space that we had. It's simply an amazing resume of awards and accomplishments and writings. We have some of his books here, and we're delighted to make you aware of those. They're on the table there in the foyer, and you will look through those. He just has a new book coming out, or has just come out, which we mentioned here in his little introduction. But I just want to say a word personally about Dr. Fant, and that is that during my 40 years at Union, I got to know him, work with him in a number of different ways. And I grew to appreciate him, and I would even say love him dearly as a man of God, as a great scholar, a wonderful preacher and teacher, and a man, well, I'll just say it the way the Lord said it of Bartholomew, "Behold an Israelite in whom there is no guile." As is true of many visitors that we have here to the Black Hills, this is his first time in South Dakota. And you're here in paradise, Dr. Fant, Brother Gene. This is a wonderful, wonderful place. This is the best kept secret in America. And we're glad that you're here. We ordered this weather just for you. It's always like this in late October. No, he read about the blizzard, so he knows better than that. But we are delighted to have Dr. Gene Fant. I called him up and asked if he would consider this, and he was gracious enough. He's very, very busy. He has so many demands on his schedule and his time, but he was gracious to open up this weekend for us, and we are just delighted that he's here. So, will you join me in giving a warm, warm Black Hills welcome to our special guest for the C.S. Lewis Legacy Conference, Dr. Gene Fant.
So I don't need that one, right? I'm going to try not to knock it over. Well, it is really and truly a pleasure to be with you and to have the opportunity to come to South Dakota. Richard was so funny, he said, "Would you actually come?" like if he invited me, I would say yes and then bail on him or something. I don't know if there's a history on that or something, but I do want to make a few prefatory remarks. Thank you, Dr. Shattuck, for your overview, because that saves so much time to do this. This is actually the second C.S. Lewis conference I've spoken at this week. we had one at Union. I think I've counted up. There's about a dozen of them going on over the next month or so. And this is probably the only one where the opening address is why I hate C.S. Lewis. I thought I would intrigue you all with that just a little bit, and I'll explain what I mean by that as we go through our address here at this time. But I do want to make sure you're aware of a couple of things. First off, it's okay to laugh. If you think, did he mean that to be funny? Yes, I did mean that to be funny. It's okay. There's an old saying that God is a comedian who's playing to an audience that's afraid to laugh. And sometimes I feel that way when we're doing an academic conference where we're supposed to be all serious. And the other thing you need to know about me is I have massive, massive ADD. And so in the middle of the lecture, I may lose my place just because I've gone down a road. I have no idea where I found myself, and now I have to extricate myself. My ADD actually used to be a lot worse. I used to drink 10 to 12 cans of Mountain Dew a day. And my cardiologist advised me that that was unwise. He ran an EKG. I was getting a checkup when I turned 40. And the doctor looked at that EKG strip and said, "Your heartbeat is really crazy. Tell me a little bit about your coffee intake." And I said, "I don't drink coffee." And he said, "Well, tea? Don't drink tea." "Well, what do you drink?" And I said, "Mountain Dew." "How much?" I said, "I don't know, 10 to 12 cans a day." And he's like, "Oh my gosh." So there you go. So I don't ping quite as much. I gave up most of my caffeine. I haven't had... I joke that I went Mormon for a while. I don't do caffeine except for a little bit now, every now and then. On the books that I have out there are 3 books out there. One is Expectant Moments, which is a book I wrote with my wife. It's for couples who are expecting a baby. If any of you need a shower gift, it's a great shower gift. It came out with Zondervan. Wow. We wrote it when we were pregnant with our children, so they're in 10th grade now, so that book's probably 14 years old now, but I've got some of those out there. God is Author, which is an overview of a biblical interpretation of how we can go to literature and find the gospel in all literatures of all times. That's been out for a few years. And then the one that just came out is an overview of the liberal arts. That one's with Crossway. It's a part of the new Crossway series on reclaiming the Christian intellectual tradition. And I've got all of them out there for $10. They're all anywhere between $14 to $18, I think, on cover price. But I've got some out there if you want to purchase those, that'd be great. And then one last thing before I get to my actual text, and that is just to let you know, my goal in the three things I'm going to do here is to reflect what liberal learning is really about. Liberal learning is different from a lot of other learning in that in liberal learning, we're not trying to learn how to do something, we're not trying to learn about something, we're trying to learn from things. And when we learn from things, we keep those things alive. And so my goal in these three things is not really, it's not, my first tier goal is not to teach you about Lewis. It's to look at some things where we can learn from Lewis. First on the idea that we stand in a great tradition. Second, that we have the opportunity to expose ourselves to a lot of things in light of the gospel and in light of the Holy Spirit. And then the third one is how important it is for us to understand that the life of the mind includes the supernatural. It's not just imagination, it's also the supernatural, and we'll go on from there. The other thing I want to do, of course, is thank Richard Wells and the college for inviting me. And Richard is an amazing ambassador for the college. It was so funny watching him wrestle through this when he was at Union. It was sort of like watching somebody under conviction of the Holy Spirit ready to make a conversion. He was like, yes, Jesus, I'll follow you to South Dakota. And of course, it was not an unknown process, but it was interesting to watch him and Carol going through that. And they are marvelous ambassadors for the region and for the institution and so forth. Now, I have a degree, my doctorate's in 17th century literature. It's partly because of my ADD. I went to the library and looked at the shelves. And the idea behind a doctorate is that you've read everything in your field and you're now going to produce and contribute to the field. And so I went to Russian novels, which are all about that thick and mostly about like the dog died, at least we'll have meat this winter. That's kind of the theme of all of them. They're all depressing and so forth. Interesting character studies. I really wanted to do my doctorate in Faulkner. I'm a Mississippian. I have a cousin who was in William Faulkner's daughter's wedding, believe it or not. His college roommate married Faulkner's daughter. I thought about that, but I kept looking at all the shelves upon shelves of things that were being written there. I love Shakespeare, and we produce a book of scholarship on Hamlet every business day of every year, and I knew there was no way I could keep up with that. Remember, I have ADD, so I was like, bing, bing, bing. So I ended up with this sonnet, which is 14 lines long. I picked a sonnet by the first woman to publish on the sonnets, Lady Mary Roth, in the 1621. Which again, the scholarship was 4 books. I figured this is great, I can do 4 books, this is awesome. And so I went on that way, and because of this, I have lots of overlapping interests with Lewis. And so it's not so much that I'm a Lewis scholar, by any stretch of the imagination, as much as I am a Lewis admirer, which is actually where my topic comes from today. Because I admire him, I also sort of despise him, because he's so stinking smart, and he's written on so many different things. And I'm certain that there are others here who are actually a lot more capable than I am to deal in some of the details and some of the actualities of his works. But what I wanted to do today was kind of look at some different approaches that we can do. And so I've started off with this intentionally provocative title, Why I Hate C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton and Augustine. I can add a ton of other authors to it. And it really is an outgrowth of a stream of thought that I've had over the years. And I do think that it's really helpful for a conference such as this, especially that's being sponsored by a school such as Witherspoon. Many years ago, I was doing a presentation on Christian liberal arts and literature, and I was talking about how we can redeem the literatures of different eras, even different cultural traditions and all. And at the end of the lecture, I went back to my office and was checking their email, and one of the gentlemen who had attended the lecture said, I was curious about why you didn't reference Augustine's looting of the Egyptians. And he had a little quotation in there from Augustine. And I went to my shelves and pulled off Augustine, and I found my marked text where I had read the passage he was referring to. I had little margin notes in it and stuff like that, but for some reason I had never referenced it in the lecture. And what I realized, it's not plagiarism, because I wasn't stealing his ideas, but I realized I was taking his ideas and I was mixing them with other things, I was synthesizing them. But when I got up there, I basically was saying, isn't it cool to do this, instead of saying, Augustine says it's cool to do this. I kind of missed a big opportunity, and this is one of the great anxieties that we have as Christian thinkers, Christian writers, Christian speakers, and so forth, is we start realizing how easy it is, especially when we've read broadly at all, how easy it is to forget exactly what all we've read and what all has gone into these noggins of ours. Because the brain is an amazing thing. Do you ever have memories of things, and you have no idea why you have that memory? I got on Google Earth one time. My dad was a church planter in Buffalo, New York, so the blizzard would have been fine with me. I did grow up in Buffalo. I know what it's like to get 25 inches of snow overnight and still go to school the next day, right? I was looking at Google Earth, and I thought, I'm going to go visit the town I grew up in, Fredonia, New York. And I was going around and saw this thing, and it was this fountain that was in front of a house. And all of a sudden I remember that house. And I clicked through, and it had a street view, and I was looking at the house, and I sent the link to my dad, and I said, don't you remember this house was like 2 blocks from our house when I was in kindergarten? And he said, yes. Why do you even remember that? I don't understand why you remember that. I said, it's just the way my brain works. Well, when you read lots of these folks, that's the way your brain works. There's something that resonates in you, and you can't quite tap why it is. You haven't read it in a while, or you don't remember it, and so forth. And so these things will start to come back out. And what's interesting about this is there's a reality, and that reality is that we're shaped by whom we've read. But what's interesting is we're also shaped by those who were read by those whom we've read. I'll back up and say that again. We're shaped by those whom we've read, but we're also shaped by those who were read by those whom we've read. It's a really different thing. And we can telescope that back through history and go into a hall of mirrors almost. And just watch that telescoping back all through history. Some time ago, I blogged for First Things, which is a journal. Currently, they're calling that blog First Thoughts. And I just posted something on it this week about the peculiar Calvinism of William Faulkner. William Faulkner was interesting. He believed in total depravity, but he believed that the atonement was so limited that nobody got it, and God was mean. It's a very interesting idea, okay? Well, at that blog, I posted a thing about why I'm, quote-unquote, sick and tired of C.S. Lewis. And in that, I talked about how it seems like every time I think I've come up with a good idea, somebody that I mention it to says, oh yeah, well, C.S. Lewis once said, or G.K. Chesterton, it's interesting you say that, Chesterton has a whole book on that, or oh, by the way, in Augustine's City of God, or whatever. And when I posted that up, the comments were hilarious. There was one guy who said, I literally gasped aloud when I read the title of your post. Another guy said, it was Plato who wrote about everything first, as Lewis reminds us, which you have to think through why that's pretty cheeky. I thought it was pretty comical. One reader noted even that Chesterton and Lewis were terribly prolific writers, and essentially they were the bloggers of their day. They had radio addresses that were transcribed frequently. They had newsletters that they were publishing as well. In the case of Chesterton, he was doing weekly columns, very similar to what we do nowadays in blogs, about the same length even for some of those formats. And so Augustine's lengthy City of God, which is a marvel of length and complexity, is matched by Chesterton and Lewis and so forth in length, but not necessarily in sustained focus, because they did deal with so many different ideas and all. And so I would ask you to think about the difference between publishing in our era and the way that publishing used to be. So it used to be, you think about how miraculous it is that we have a book like The City of God or Augustine's Confessions or any of those kinds of things that had to be preserved by hand, transmitted through handwritten manuscripts. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to do that before, but it's an amazing process. You think about it, for something like biblical transmission or Augustine's works prior to the printing press, every page meant a sheep or a lamb or a goat had to die for every single page. And think about that for the biblical text, the symbolism that's there, that every page of the Bible required the death of a lamb or a goat. And not just for that, so a book, to own a book or a codex was an amazing, amazing price for the sheep community in particular. It's a little like the chicken and the egg for breakfast, or the chicken and the pig for breakfast. For the pig it's a sacrifice, for the goat, or for the pig, it's a sacrifice. For the chicken, it's a contribution. There's a little difference there for the egg. But nowadays, all you have to do is have an internet connection. Right? Anybody can publish on anything they want. For those of us who do this sort of thing, who have blogs and so forth, it's amazing. A buddy of mine, Hunter Baker, who's at Union, he has a personal blog and then he has a number of professional blogs. And on his personal blog, he usually just puts anecdotes. He's writing the news, he'll put something on there. But one day his personal blog got picked up by Real Clear Politics, which is an online, very popular thing, linked in often with the Drudge Report and so forth. And he watched all of a sudden him go from having about 20 readers, which is his norm, to having about 2,000 readers in one day. A really good, popular, scholarly book these days will sell about 800 to 1,000 copies. That's an academic scholarly press book. 800 to 1,000 copies. In a library, it'll circulate a little bit. You'll have some people who maybe pick it up for a class or something like that. But over the lifetime of that book, if you have 2,000 readers of that, it really is the equivalent of being pretty much a bestseller. And it's hard for us to think about the scale being that small, but it really is. Now, I write for two blogs, First Things and the Chronicle of Higher Education. At First Things, a really good blog post will get about 2,000 click-throughs in a week, about 2,000 discrete readers, which means in a week, I can have my idea exposed to the same number of people that the lifetime of one of my books would do. At the Chronicle of Higher Education, where we have something on the order of, I think it's 70 million discrete page clicks a year in the whole website. When I've got one that does well over there, we can have 15 to 20,000 discrete clicks in a 24-hour period. It's a really amazing thing that we're dealing with now. Now, the reach of it, Al Mohler, no less than Al Mohler, the president of Southern Baptist Seminary, is asking the question about whether scholars are being irresponsible if they don't blog, because the reach is so quick and so far. But you get somebody like Lewis and Chesterton, well, they were able to take advantage of the means of their day, the newsletter in the case of Chesterton and the radio in the case of Lewis. So much of what we have with Lewis that we now call essays really started off as radio addresses, especially during the Second World War, where because of his war background, he had a particular level of authority that was very much able to reach out to people. But these guys were not only prolific, they really have staying power. I appreciate Richard's comments about this amazing thing that with John F. Kennedy, we will celebrate his life, we'll celebrate the legacy that his family has had in American politics and stuff like that. But there are Lewis conferences all over the place. England, Ireland, US, you name it, they're all over the place. It's because the ideas and the concepts are so incredibly potent. They've influenced so many of us. And even though blog posts may have a little bit of permanence just because of the digital era's prodigious memory, it's not necessarily the significance of the ideas that preserve them. But in the case of Lewis and these other folks, it really is the significance of the ideas. They are doing some amazing things in their writings. And how many times have we picked up something like Surprised by Joy, and all of a sudden we realize he's articulating things that we've never been able to articulate ourselves. And what an amazing opportunity that is. I'm going to talk about this as well tonight. When we come to somebody of the stature of C.S. Lewis, we're really talking about a fire hose of a thinker. It's sort of like you start to have the conversation and you're like, stop, I can't take it all in. You know, it's just, you ever had a professor who was like that? I had a medievalist professor, professor of medieval literature who was like that. I would come home every night, all I could do was try to repeat everything we've talked about in class. I thought the guy was amazing. In hindsight, he wasn't as good as I thought he was then, but he was also wrong a lot. And my wife ended up taking him for a class, and she would come home and say, I think he told us something that's wrong. And the more I started thinking about it, the more I thought, wow, he made a lot of mistakes in class. But I think it was the scotch in his thermos that he had that may have had something to do with it. But you think about it, he's not just a fire hose of a thinker. He is someone who is translating for us other fire hoses of thinkers. And that's the beauty of him. He's an interpreter for us. And that's why he's so powerful and so potent, is in many ways he's a translator of what has been the brightest and the best and what's gone on before, especially with the kind of particular education he had, both self-educated as well as formally educated. He's really someone who can translate the ideas that have come before and articulate them in ways that resonate with really the average everyday person. And so, in particular, he was influenced by Chesterton, I think because of the sense of humor, certainly by Augustine and Plato, and you can go on with all the other philosophical influences and stuff. But what we have when we start to think about the way that these things are all linked together is we start to see this incredible daisy chain of history. That we deal with a koinonia of ideas, a fellowship of ideas in a Christian idea, or the classical education would use the term enkyklos paideia, which is this circle of scholars, circle of teachers, circle of learners who pass along ideas. And the idea is that everything we have is a transmission of something that has come previously. That we have altered these ideas maybe for our own era, we've updated them for our understanding, but really you've got to understand that there's a Christian notion in this, and that is that all knowledge is discovery, no knowledge is created. And that's a very important point for us to understand. Science never creates anything, it merely alters what has come before. The humanities never create anything out of whole cloth. It constantly is coming back and taking these things up. William Faulkner, for instance, in his novel As I Lay Dying, there's a film adaptation that just came out of this week. James Franco has adapted it. He in that is really ripping off Hawthorne, he's ripping off Stephen Crane, he's ripping off a bunch of other folks. And that's kind of the fun for us as scholars, is to read something and go, oh, I see what he's doing here. He's really cribbing off of James Joyce or whatever. And then we go to Joyce, and we can work that all the way back. Lewis and others are doing that. And for Christians, we really see this as an important point, because this is how this works. God made the universe in such a way as to reveal himself through the universe, which means the universe functions in such a way as to be meaningful and intelligible. That means then that when we look, I mean, you think about this, empiricism, which is the idea that we can know by the senses and so forth. Animals are empiricists. That's how my dog knows which dogs are his friend, her friends. She sniffs, she looks, she smells, she's basically an empiricist in that way, and she can repeat it. She knows which ones are which. It's amazing how she's able to pick and choose friends and relatives who are coming into the house, and that's because she's just using it. The universe is discoverable, it's predictable. We have lots of different things that we can do along that line. But here's the thing, God has created a universe that's capable of being understood, which means that discoveries can be made, they can be passed along, they can be refined upon, but the intellectual version of the law of the conservation of matter means that there are no ideas that are ultimately created or destroyed, they're only shaped, they're reworked, they're moved in other areas. And that's a really important thing for us, because this means everything comes from something. And if we follow it all the way back, what we find is that everything comes ultimately from God. It's either true to God's original intent, or it is a manipulation, an error based on God's original intent. I'm going to talk about that some tonight as well. Well, the problem that we have with a lot of what's happening today in terms of education, in terms of theories and all, is that these they would view this idea that things come from other things as being hopelessly unromantic. It's like, I always thought that writers would sit there, they'd get struck by lightning and have inspiration, and they'd write the story, and there you go. To go back to William Faulkner, he wrote, As I Lay Dying, he claimed, I wrote it in 6 weeks and never changed a word. And that was what he told his press release, tell him on the press release, I wrote it in 6 weeks at night, working in a power plant as a coal stoker at the power plant at Ole Miss. And he said, I never changed a word. Now, we have his manuscripts. We know that he changed words. We have scratch-throughs. We've got all this other stuff. But it's this romantic idea that we can just create, and we can do, and we can live, and we can whatever. Okay, well, the problem with this is it's very unromantic to say that you can't do that. And I need to say that that's unromantic with a capital R, because romanticism is the philosophical idea that's really in play here. We have a very romantic idea about that, the natural man, the raw, noble savage, or whatever, can come up with all kinds of wonderful things. This is coming out of 19th century thought. It's very particularly popular in the United States and in our institutions. And you see it like crazy. This idea that inside of all of us is all we ever need to have. So my kids go to a public academic magnet school. It's the best public school in the region, and the first day we went to take a tour of it, they have a mural on the wall, and the mural has a picture of a path through a garden, and the mural says, "Follow your heart, it will always lead you to truth." Now, as a Christian, I've got a problem with that, because the heart is perverse. Who can explain the heart? I think it's Jeremiah that has that. But that really is reflective of how people think about it. I've been to so many faculty development sessions in so many different places where they basically talk about how all teachers are doing is guiding students to discover the truth they already have in themselves. And I just want to jam hot knitting needles into my eye sockets or something every time they talk about it. It really bothers me. Because I'm like, when did Walt Disney become a great educational theorist? Follow your heart, it's great, And one of the things that I like to do in that is to remind them about a quotation that Woody Allen gave. Woody Allen had been married to his wife for some time, Mia Farrow, right? And one day she was cleaning out the closet and giving some things to Goodwill. And as she cleaned out the pockets of Woody's overcoat, some Polaroid photos fell out of her daughter, his stepdaughter, naked in his coat pocket. And so she confronted him over it and found out that he had been having an affair with his stepdaughter, his adult stepdaughter, for some time. They're now married, Sunyi Previn Allen. They've been married for some time now. But I think it was Time Magazine interviewed him, and they got to this question. And when they asked him about it, you need a t-shirt with this on it. His response was, "The heart wants what the heart wants." Who am I to argue with that? Wow, there's your justification. Well, this is the problem that we got with a lot of educational theory that we have now. It's all about what I want. It's all about personality and so forth. In fact, let me read you something. Brown University, Ivy League institution, if you've ever been to it, beautiful campus on a ridge there overlooking the harbor there in Rhode Island. At Brown, they still have a general education requirement, which is sort of the common curriculum that all the students are supposed to take. But they've got rid of saying, oh, but you actually have to take these classes. So like at Union, you have to take 2 English, Comp, 2 World Lids, History. You go through all the different things here. Here you have a very integrated core because of the way that readings are done. But I want to read for you what Brown, this is on their webpage describing their core curriculum. It's just amazing. I'm quoting. "Our open curriculum ensures you great freedom in directing the course of your education. But it also expects you to remain open to people, ideas, and experiences that may be entirely new. By cultivating such openness, you'll learn to make the most of the freedom you have and to chart the broadest possible intellectual journey. Brown's liberal learning goals, which you can read by clicking on the link below, and they have a little link there, will orient you to Brown's educational ethos and help you to guide your course selection during your 4 years of undergraduate study. In addition to completing a concentration, you're expected to take sample courses in humanities, social sciences, life sciences, physical sciences, but the real challenge is to make connections between those courses using the perspective gained from the one discipline as a window into that." Now that sounds good, but here's the big thing that I really hate. "Each student's journey through the Brown curriculum is unique, and each semester of study constitutes a chapter in their own curricular narratives. What will your story be?" And what they basically say is, you've got to take 15 classes, you get to pick the 15 classes, and do with them what you build the connection. Follow your intellectual heart, see what's going on. Now the problem with that is it leads to what's actually a very dangerous view of what it means to be educated. Everything is about so-called personal choice. Now I can't tell you how many times I've had a student come sit in my office and say, "Hey Dr. Fant, I got this great idea. A baccalaureate degree with us is 128 hours. The student will say, "I got this great idea. What if you do away with all requirements and we just take whatever classes we want up to 128 hours? Would that be awesome?" And I'll say, "Okay, well, why do we have you take the classes we have you take?" And they'll say, "Well, because it's in the catalog." And I'll say, "Well, I have 5 degrees. And I think that what we have you do is pretty good and pretty transformative. And for you to say, you don't think what I'm telling you you need to do is kind of arrogant for an 18-year-old, right?" And I know, I don't mean to, I'm like, but basically what they're saying is, well, I design my own life a lot better than you people can. And isn't that a problem that we have in our culture at large? a lot of people who are just saying, well, I can do it better than anybody else can. Why don't you just let me be the captain of my own ship and so forth? Well, this personal choice as a curricular guide creates a wide-ranging set of ramifications. In fact, it's completely changed what we mean by liberal arts education. I'm a big proponent of the liberal arts, got a whole book on it and everything, but here's the thing. When I hear people talk about the liberal arts now, what they're meaning is something completely different than the way that I learned it. What they mean now is that anything that's external to the individual is wrong and a shackle. So morality is a shackle because it tells you you might not know what's right and wrong, but shouldn't you get to do it? Society is an impediment. Who are we to let society tell us what to do? Religion is a fetter. Religion turns you into a slave. I could spend the whole night telling you stories about being in graduate school as an evangelical Christian. And I was at a relatively intellectually conservative institution. But I remember one night this classmate of mine came up to me, this really interesting guy, and he looked, it was like smoking break. If the professors didn't have scotch in the thermos, they all had cigarettes, you know. And although we did have one professor who used to go on crying jags in class, she would like just, I don't know what was going on. It was like Holly Hunter in broadcast news. She would just like, in the middle of class, and we'd all like quietly leave the room while she was having her, I don't know what's going on. Well, we had one of these breaks, and this guy comes up to me, he looks about the waves, and he goes, Gina, I heard you're a Christian. Yeah, you know, it was like, seriously, this is this question. You don't seem mentally ill. And I said, I'm not, and I don't understand the question. So he starts talking about Freud and religious delusion and all this other stuff. He pulls out a little bit of Marx about, you know, the whole opiate of the people and all that good stuff. And he said, so let me get this straight. I mean, this is blowing his mind that I'm doing a doctorate, and he knew I already had a couple of master's degrees. So this is blowing his mind and all that. And he says, so let me get this straight, dude. Do you know anything about science? And I said, well, yeah, actually, my undergraduate degree is actually in biology. I took honors work in philosophy, history and philosophy of science, stuff like that. And he was like, but you're a Christian. Yeah. And he said, well, don't you know that defies all the laws of science? And I said, well, yeah, that's why we call it a miracle. And it's just like, and what's really funny is the guy ended up becoming a Christian the next year, and now he's a Methodist pastor who's like leading like one of the rescue, you know, there's a big movement happening in the United Methodist Church now to restore the original Wesleyan vision for orthodoxy and so forth. And he's one of the guys that's leading that. And it all started, I mean, I love it. This is, you know, me getting to be like little, you know, like minister or something, you know, over there. It all started with that little conversation. And what he was getting at, though, was what is wrong with that you would submit yourself intellectually to anything else? Shouldn't you be the one that's making that charge? Well, this is the problem. We become intellectually self-made men and women, and this allows us then to move into unbelievable arrogance. Because once we think we're the smartest person in the room, and you've been with that guy or that gal, right? Well, it's like, well, I won't say who, but this is actually a really funny story, but I can't use names because they're videotaping and it'll show up on their audio or something. It'll show up on somebody's YouTube thing or something, but I've got a friend who went to Princeton for his PhD, and he was on the radio with another friend of mine, and the host of the show said to my friend, by the way, can you make sure to mention at least once or twice that this guy went to Princeton, because the guy was really big. I'm making sure that people knew he went to Princeton and stuff. And my friend said, you know, we could have a drinking game based on how often this guy mentions that he went to Princeton. And that would be really, really bad. Well, you get these folks that are like that. They're kind of full of themselves. They're a little bit pretentious and so forth. But really what you get down to is a very interesting idea, which is that a lot of this stuff owes its nature more to the New Age movement, which also is an outgrowth of Romanticism, as much as it does to even the Enlightenment. And so you get these really weird things. Have you noticed how irrational sometimes people are when they talk about intellectual things? I mean, I hear Steven Pinker at MIT is doing this big thing now about all decisions we have need to be based on science. And I'm like, really? All of them? Let's talk about when this thing becomes a human. Because the last time I checked, you can do a DNA sample on on a baby immediately after conception, and it's like, so you really want to go down that trail, dude? And really, because there's a whole lot of other stuff we can talk about with that as well. Well, the classical liberal arts model was not about being liberated from externalities. The classical liberal arts model was about being liberated from yourself. Because they understood that the worst form of slavery is the slavery we impose on ourselves. When you read classical literature like the Aeneid and Ovid and all these, there are depictions of all sorts of immorality that are in these stories. But the immorality is there to teach us that we should not be slaves to desire. We should not be slaves to money. We shouldn't be slaves to those things. Read Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. It's all about how you are not born to lie around in bed and just enjoy the warm, cozy covers. You be a man, get out of bed. Well, there's a big lesson our society needs. Be a man, get out of bed. Well, there's a whole lot of levels we could go with on that, in fact. Education was designed to free us from that kind of slavery in order to serve a higher calling. Now, for the Greeks and the Romans, that higher calling was typically the state or something like that. When you read Virgil's Aeneid, when Aeneas is going away from Dido, and he's pulling out of this sensual relationship that he's allowed himself to get into, when I think it's Mercury comes and says to him, "Why are you doing this? Don't you understand that you have a duty?" And so then it talks about that Aeneas was duty-bound to leave behind the error of his ways. And this is what it's all about. In fact, when you read something that's even as, it doesn't sound like a liberal arts thing, but Frederick Douglass's Autobiography of an Ex-Slave, when you read his autobiographies, he talks about that it was when he learned how to read that he realized that the present-day circumstances were not all there was, that if he could just teach himself to learn how to read and write and have an opportunity, he could get away from slavery. And he says, in fact, this basic statement: once you are literate, you are no longer fit to be a slave. Now, let that sink in for a minute and think about it in terms of our society. Because we now have a large part of our society that promotes illiteracy, or post-literacy anyways. We can read and write, but nobody cares. Wasn't it Mark Twain that said the books that you choose not to read are just the same in effect as the books that you cannot read? The being post-literate and illiterate are basically the same thing. Well, we start getting this idea that to be liberated is to be set free from ourselves. Originally. Now it's been flipped around that to be liberated is to be all about yourself, and it's one of the lectures I enjoy doing with our freshmen. I'll go through and show them YouTube videos of celebrities and the trouble they've gotten into because they've tried to just do things the way that they want to. But it leads also to a really bizarre thing, at least in my mind as well. And I want to get at this by going in a slightly weird angle. I want to talk about research papers in freshman composition. When I've taught freshman comp for years and years and years, in English we use the Modern Language Association style sheet. That's where you put a parenthesis, author, last name, page number. We've got all these different things that we do with all that. Well, when I was doing a postdoc in educational theory, we were having to use the APA style guide, which is the American Psychological Association's style sheet, and it's the one that's used by most of the social sciences. And it was driving me crazy because what you do in that one is you cite the author and the date, not the page number. Now, in my mind, the MLA one where we cite the page number is a form of the scientific method. The scientific method is designed so that we don't have to repeat everything all the time, right? So we don't have to, we got hydrogen and we light it and it glows and then there's water that precipitates out because the chemical reaction happens. We don't have to repeat that experiment except for to illustrate it for people. Science is about building and reproducing based on efficiencies that we get from this. So in an English paper, the one I'll do tomorrow is one that's a lot more heavily footnoted and so forth. In that one, if I've got a direct quote, I've got a reference to it, you can go get that book off the shelf, look at it, you'll find the direct quotation and so forth. It's a way of documenting all that. Well, in APA, they really don't care about what page numbers things are on. All they care about is the date the thing was published. And I went through and was really kind of struggling with this style of documentation, and I went to one of my professors, and this is a really interesting opportunity to learn from the dude. Went to him and I said, no, look, I don't get this, okay? Now, the direct quotation in APA, we cite the page number, but if we're citing the ideas, all we do is put all that, and it's author and date, and so forth. And when I write a paper using APA, I do a cursory review of some of the research, but you've already told me that I have to exclude anything that's older than 10 years old. And he said, yes. I said, well, I don't understand. Why do I have to exclude anything that's older than 10 years old? And this is what he said. The newer the research, the more reliable it is. The older the research, the less valuable it is. We're a forward-looking profession, not a backward-looking one. Now, I had a PhD in medieval Renaissance literature. The dude was basically dissing me right there and saying, well, your discipline is stupid. Well, he's barking up the wrong tree with me. In fact, I would argue that a lot of stuff that we've got going now is significantly flawed, philosophically speaking. And just to say, because it's old, it's not valuable, is kind of a dumb, okay, I'll say it, it's a dumb thing. But this anecdote illustrates this, okay? How easy it is to go from things being about personal choice to suddenly being caught only in the moment because you are only in the moment. And so what is 10 years old for you is not going to be 10 years old for other people in the future and stuff like that. And isn't it amazing how we gain this hostility toward things that are old? And it seems like we cultivate this all the time. We have a church in our area that does contemporary worship. And when we moved to town, we visited this church. And I heard some students who had also visited talking about the service. I was really curious to hear what they had to say. And one of the students said, they call that contemporary worship. Some of those songs were written in like 2002. I was laughing, So they were like, that's not contemporary, So there you go. But we do this now. But isn't it, I watch a lot of TV, more TV than I should, I'm sure. But isn't it amazing how many networks now are springing up that specifically show old shows because people long for that stuff? Because the new stuff is so horrible. And even the new stuff, half of it is a remake of the old stuff. I saw today, CBS is trying to resurrect a series that was popular for them 10, 12 years ago because they're out of ideas. Well, why are they out of ideas? They're out of ideas because they don't go to the past. And then all of a sudden they go, maybe we need to look at this. Why do we keep getting all these comic book movies? Because they're looking to the past and, maybe comic book. Well, why don't you go even farther than that? Look at some other stuff that's pretty amazing. I honestly think that it's one of the reasons behind the push to move to digital books is because digital books are kind of an equality of falseness. Well, this book and this book, they must be the same because they're both in there. Well, this has been in print for 300 years. Why do you think it's been in print for 300 years? The average book, by the way, the average book that comes in on the market now, I think the average one only stays in print for about 18 months. Digital has changed that because now they can just keep them going. But prior to the advent of the digital stuff went away very quickly. That's why you go to bookstores, you find all that stuff that was like on the dollar shelf and all that. Well, let me continue with that point about we go from the personal to the contemporary that is to the exclusion of other stuff. And then I think there's actually something that's pretty dangerous that comes out of that. A few years ago, I got to go to Ukraine. And while I was there, I did a bunch of faculty development lectures at 3 different universities in eastern Ukraine. Had an incredible time. These are people who have no resources whatsoever at their colleges, but the enthusiasm for learning is absolutely jaw-dropping. And the last day that we were there, we got to go into the capital of Ukraine, Kiev, and we got to take some tours. And one of the most amazing things that's there in the heart of the old city is the Cathedral of St. Sophia. Anybody ever been there by any chance? You can Google it, Kiev, St. Sophia. It's amazing. The foundations for this thing were built possibly as early as 950. It's unbelievable. Patterned after a number of other ancient buildings. So the building itself, the oldest parts of the building are right at 1,000 years old. And then just down the street from it was the Cathedral of St. Michael, which was built in the 1100s. So at one time in this city, the main boulevard was anchored by 2 cathedrals, one that was started in 950, the other was started in 1100. unbelievable. It's just dripping with ancient history. I'm a Baptist, so we're fascinated by the smells and the bells at those places. You know, you go in for worship and it's, you know, you got the iconostasis. They had little skirts at the doors because women could not come in wearing slacks. So all our students had to put on well, not all of our students, but the female students had to put the skirts on before we could go in there. The one of St. Sophia is on the UNESCO list of world culture sites as one of the great examples of this kind of building and stuff like that. But the one at St. Michael's is the one that caught my attention because as we went and we toured it, there was a guy in a huge black Mercedes over on the side, and there's a priest walking around the car saying something, and my host said, by the way, that's probably a mafia guy. He's getting his car blessed by the priest. That's one of the things that they'll do for protection stuff. I thought that was kind of interesting. So we're going through on that, and I said, wow, what year was this church built? And he said, oh, it was built 10 years ago. And I said, what? He said, yeah. In the 1930s, the Soviets tore down the 1,000-year-old version of the building because they said it was an eyesore, and they said it really wasn't that old anyways. And because it was not as old as they said it was a lie, and it needed to come down. So the Soviets had torn down this 1,000-year-old cathedral. Now, what you got to understand is the Soviet Union, Russia, Moscow, had at one time been a colony of Ukraine. And the Russians were very paranoid, the Soviets were very paranoid that the Ukrainians would remember their history and who used to be in charge. And so at every turn during the 1930s, the Russians would tear down all of these incredible cultural sites. Now the reason they didn't get St. Sophia is that the French government, the French crown apparently had given some money to help build that somewhere along the way, and they were able to protect it. But you go all over town, and what you would find are all these things that were now resurrected, because when the Ukrainians regained their autonomy, their sovereignty, the first thing they did was go back and rebuild the past, because they knew that in the past they had had glories, and they wanted to inspire their people by this. I thought, well, this prioritization of the present, or at least the most recent past, is a deeply disturbing act, especially for Christians, because faith is a backward-walking act. Have you ever thought about that before? When you go to the scriptures, what you find is that we are not really encouraged to look at the future and stuff like that. What we're encouraged to do is to look at the past and look at God as we walk. So we can say, I was in trouble here, and God was faithful at that time, and if I'm having trouble now, he'll be faithful here. And then you take a step, and you see that time where there was trouble and God was faithful. This time where you need protection. Richard and I just almost got clocked tonight on the way in. We missed getting hit by a car about that far. It was really kind of sobering. His hair was not white before that. But we do that. This is what faith is all about. And so in Christianity, the scriptures constantly challenge us to look to the past and how God has acted. This is what everything was set up. When your children ask you why you do this, you tell them this is because God was faithful and he will continue to be faithful. And so when we do look at the future, we look at the future having a sense of confidence because of everything that's happened in the past. And this is the entire structure of Psalm 23. David's looking at his life and going, God has been faithful, he will continue to be faithful, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever and ever. Yaroslav Pelikan, who is a really important theologian and thinker of the end of the 20th century, noted that tradition is the living faith of the dead, while traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. Anti-traditionalism, which is where we've got a lot of folks working from nowadays, is the bullying of the dead by the living. And that's really disturbing. I find myself being constantly aggravated not by the supposedly cold hand of the past, but by the iron hand of ignorance that's allowed to reign at the present. And this time bullying is short-sighted at best and insidious at worst. In fact, I think we ought to call it chronological snobbery. But wait! I can't call it chronological snobbery. Anybody know why I can't? C.S. Lewis and Owen Barfield already talked about that. So, I've kind of done this little sucker punch on you all here, okay? We can go on these things, we can build all these brilliant articles and stuff, these ideas, we can elucidate what we're doing, we can come up and say, well, I think we've got bullying of the past. And then you talk about somebody and go, well, Lewis actually wrote about that and learning in wartime and the abolition of man and stuff like that. And then that's where Lewis drives me crazy. Here I am, rolling along, trying to have a nice argument, trying to talk about present-day educational practice, and all I'm ending up doing is rehashing what's happened in The Abolition of Man, which is one of Lewis's most significant works. Now, it wasn't Lewis, it was his buddy Owen Barfield who probably coined that phrase, best we can tell. But Lewis is the one that really went off on it and really expanded it. And by focusing on the modern or the progressive, he would say, we willfully create cultural and moral amnesia. Moral amnesia that hamstrings true progress. And what's amazing to me is that in the name of science, or rather scientism, chronological snobs violate the very effective methods of the scientific method. The incredible power of the scientific method is that it allows us to break free from constantly repeating the past. Trying to re-demonstrate stuff. We can build on it. We don't have to replicate groundbreaking discoveries and experiments all the time because we've affirmed their value, we've documented them, we've done all this other stuff. Can you imagine the ridiculousness of the astronomer who claims that Kepler or Hubble were irrelevant because their discoveries were made so long ago? No, that's stupid. Those discoveries that have been made subsequently owe their very nature to those who paved the path for them. And as science should be self-consciously past-oriented even as it's looking at all that. In my field of literature, I see this stuff come up all the time where people look at the past and they turn their nose up at it. And I'm going to tell you an amazing thing. Dr. Shattuck, soon to be Dr. Shattuck, mentioned about Milton's Paradise Lost. 17th century, had to do a lot of stuff with Paradise Lost, studied under the great Miltonist James Sims, who was an amazing bivocational Southern Baptist pastor and church planner, did a PhD, one of the great Miltonists of our era. But I was at a conference one time and I heard a young Milton scholar boast that he had never read the Old or New Testament, and that meant he was able to read Paradise Lost in ways that were new and fresh, and that he probably had a better understanding for it than anybody else did. He was asserting that he was unsullied by the baggage of cultural context. And he was asserting that he had personal authority over Milton, that he understood what Milton really meant. Now, I don't want to be too hard on that guy, because do y'all know the thesis statement of why Milton wrote Paradise Lost? To reconcile the ways of God to man. Milton read the Bible and said, God missed it, I need to rewrite it. So, Milton was guilty of kind of doing a similar thing. But I keep waiting to read that this guy that was out there talking about Paradise Lost, I keep waiting to read that he's actually saying it's about a group of like Eskimo seal hunters meeting space aliens or something. But that's what you get. It's willful arrogance, willful ignorance. And isn't it amazing how ignorance and arrogance go together? They're two parts of a two-piece suit. And arrogance is the original sin that pumps a fist at God and says, well, I'm going to determine what's right and wrong. Thank you very much. And that's my concern about education. It's filled with chronological snobbery. It omits the very moral elements that have made actual, true education so transformational. Education is not the transmission of ideas, it's the transformation of people. It's a very different idea. I've heard experts say that a proper education should be amoral. Boy, have I heard that when at professional conferences. Well, we need to have education that's not about morality. It should be amoral. We should not have morality. The focus should be on the person, helping them to explore what's inside and bring it out. Outside in, or inside out, not outside in. But the problem is that I don't know that I've ever seen very much of a practical difference between an amoral education and an immoral education. They both tend to stoke up people who are pretty much self-centered. John Milton once said that the end or the goal of education was to repair the ruin of our first parents. You can understand why such a statement is really offensive to chronological snobs, because one, it presumes that we have some sort of ruin or deficiency on our innate perfection. Two, it presumes that we have first parents in a divine history. And three, well, it was uttered by an old guy who lived 300-something years ago. So, he's irrelevant. Well, by focusing on the defective head and the corrupted heart, we're creating generations now of students who are all head knowledge and have little in the way of imagination or moral compass. One of the things that terrifies me about ADD and the drugs that we're giving kids with ADD is it seems like some studies are showing that it squelches the imagination, and God forbid children have an imagination. Talk about that some night. Well, if we have students who have little in the way of imagination and little in the way of a moral compass, I say that we should call such kids men without chests. No way. Lewis has already got us on that one too. That's also in the abolition of men. How are we to function when we keep finding Lewis everywhere? It's sort of like we're kind of running, it's like we're out in the woods, we're going down the trail, we're going down the mountain, and then, oh, there he is, and he's driving us all crazy, right? Every time he's there, he's sitting there, he's smoking that little pipe of his, or a cigarette, because he chain smoked as well, and it's like, there you go. Okay, well, is this disheartening? Because to some extent, it feels like it ought to be a little bit disheartening. But it's not. What it is instead is a word we've lost in our culture, what it really means. It's humiliating. And I mean that in the best sense of humiliating. It humbles us. How awesome it is when I'm talking to my kids at night and we're going over the days and stuff, and one of them will say, hey, I've had this idea, Dad, and they'll unpack it. They both are such good little thinkers. It's really amazing. But they'll start unpacking something, and I'll say, well, let me go get something. I want you to read this. And it's not that I'm saying, you've got a stupid idea. It's not like, they're writing some song, and I'm saying, that's a terrible song. I like this one better. What I'm saying is, yes, you're onto something. You're going down the same path that I went down and that others have gone down. You're finding this stuff. And what I start finding with people is, we no longer have people who are intellectually humble. Who will say? I mean, I had a professor one time, I wanted to get up and slap him in the middle of the class. We caught him saying something wrong. It was actually a different guy than the other one I mentioned. We caught him saying something wrong, and one of the students was in and said, in our book it says this, and you just said this. Which one is it? And the guy said, I meant to say it that way. I was testing you to see if you would catch me. And we were all like, I lost so much respect for him in that moment. It was horrible. But this is, how hard it is, especially for people who have PhDs, to get them to say, I don't know, let me go check that out. I have learned in my classes, when students ask me a question and I don't know the answer, one of the most powerful things I can do is say, hey, I don't know, hold on a second. That's why I love Google. I love Google. I'm in the middle of class, somebody asks something, I say, I don't know, let me. I got my little PowerPoint thing going, hey, let me click out of this, let me go ahead and pull this up. I did not know that. And what it's telling them all is, hey, it's okay to not know. I was taking a doctoral class at William Farr, amazing class, amazing professor, unbelievable. We read 2 novels the entire semester, Sound and Fury, Absolute Answer. We read them out loud, line by line, like it was a Bible study. It was incredible. 4th day of class, we get to a word in one of the sentences, and of course Faulkner's sentences are like 400 pages long each. But we get to this one word, the professor says, what's that word mean? And none of us knew. These are 6 doctoral students. None of us knew what the word meant. And he said, so none of you know what the word means. And he yells at us for 10 minutes about this thing called a dictionary. And he said, if you're too proud to open a dictionary, you're too proud. I was pretty blown away by that. Well, about that same time, I was talking to a student. He just yelled at us about the dictionary, so I was feeling very humble and all. And I was talking to this student who's getting ready to graduate. This is in about April. He's getting ready to graduate. And I said, what are you going to do after graduation? You're going to go to grad school? Very bright student, very capable student. I enjoyed having him in class. And so I just kind of thought he's probably going to go on and do grad school. But I was dumbfounded by his response. This is what he said. Well, I already pretty much know everything there is about literature, so I think I'm just going to go do something else. Snot-nosed 22-year-old. I said, you know it all? Then maybe you can help me. I've been reading skaldic poetry lately, and I need some help with Snorri Sturluson and some of the other, the elders and the youngers and all this other stuff. And the kid says back to me, what are you talking about? I've never even heard of this stuff. And I said, oh, well, maybe you don't know everything then. Now I was being unfair because I had a conversation exactly like that with my grandfather. My grandfather was a very wise man, Thomas Edison Fant. How can you not be a great man when your parents name you Thomas Edison Fant, right? And so grandfather was an amazing guy. I'd love to tell you the whole story, but abandoned as an 8-year-old, raises himself. Unbelievable story of how he came to know Christ and stuff. But grandfather was one of those guys that just knew very practical, knew everything about everything. When I took my bachelor's degree, I went back to visit that summer, and grandfather said, well, you got your degree. Are you smart yet? Do you know a lot? And I said, no, I think I know some stuff. Yeah, it's pretty good. And he said, oh, really? And he said, what are you going to do now? I said, well, I guess I'll probably go on and do a master's degree. And so he said, all right. So I finished that master's degree, and I come back to him and visit him, and he says, so do you know anything yet? And And I said, I know a few things. And he said, okay, go and get my second master's degree. Come back to him, he says, do you know anything yet? I said, I'm like, there's so much I don't know. It's like every day they would open a door and I would find out this entire universe I didn't even know existed. He said, there you go. I get my doctorate, Dr. Fant now. And I go visit with my grandfather. My grandfather says, do you know anything now? And I said, all I know is that I don't even know what I don't know. And it's just like so, and he said, well, finally you're wise, because wisdom is knowing that you don't know everything, but that you can learn. And he would say you can learn devotionally. God can walk you through these different things. See, intellectual humility is little sought after these days, but it's an imperative for us as Christians, because after all, what's the beginning of wisdom? The fear of the Lord. And that implies that the beginning of all of these exercises, the foundation of all of this stuff, is intellectual humility, so that when we come to somebody like Lewis, and we think we're kind of, I got something here, and we find out it's not there, instead of being like mad about it, instead what we should do is go, I'm thinking along the same lines as somebody like that. That's what I'm trying to teach my children. They're thinking of something, and I go, hey, you need to read this essay on that. What I'm trying to teach them is, you are following in the trail after trailblazers, and you're on the same trail. And you might even get to go farther down that trail than they even got to go. For those of you who are parents, you know that feeling. You're talking to your kids and you're like, what are they going to be? You're looking at that little baby. It was a full moon last week. I had 5 former students have babies last week. It was cracking me up. And I'm looking at those pictures, and I remember what's going through all their minds. You've got that little hand wrapped around your baby the first time, and you're thinking, what is this one going to be? What has God got in store for this one? And this is the thing. We all stand on the shoulders of giants. Well, let me back that up a little bit, okay? As students and professors, we stand in a great gushing stream of knowledge, of learning, of ideas. We've received from the stream, and now we return to the stream, and we extend the stream, and this stream connects us all across generations and cultures and times. And I would be mixing metaphors to say we stand on the shoulder of giants if I'm talking about water. So what I want to say instead is this. We all drink from intellectual wells we did not dig with our own hands. We instead have this incredible, and it's a rare, historically rare opportunity to be able to read and study and reflect. Do you understand how rare that is? Historically speaking, most people worked their backs off and they went home and fell into bed. And we have this incredible luxury to be able to read and write and talk and go to conferences and do things like this. And so we're handed a bucket, we can drop down in that well, and we can pull that bucket back out, and we can drink from that bucket, and we can give thanks that we did not have to dig that well, but we can enjoy the fruit of that well. And that's the value of these guys like Augustine and Chesterton and Lewis and so forth, because they viewed what they were doing as intellectual stewardship. It's God's ideas that they're dealing with. It's not their own ideas. And the reason that sometimes we want to dislike those guys is not because they're smart or because they got there first time, but because they make us feel particular ways. But really, it's a spiritually healthy way they make us feel. It's humility. And along with humility comes this idea of stewardship. We are stewards of ideas. And God forbid that we are found to be poor stewards of ideas. And I was chuckling again. Dr. Shattuck, the Spirit must be just moving through all this stuff, because these are my last lines of this one. May each of us hear the same words that I'm certain were heard by Augustine and Chesterton and Lewis. Well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into your reward for being stewards and servants. And that's this one. The next one I want to talk about is why we read the kinds of things that we are encouraged to read as Scripture, as Christians, and the big operative word is as Christians.